you? Back for another pod.
It's always good to be back for a pod. And today we've got, just another one in our design series on a style.
Great. What style are we talking about?
Mediterranean gardens today.
That is a perfect one for Australia, certainly, but also other parts of the world. So what is a Mediterranean garden, Fleur?
Well, I tend to think of it as basically a garden that's dictated by its climatic conditions. So dry, poor nutrient soils, somewhere that's just gets a lot of harsh summer heat and some winter rain.
I think that's pretty good. And I think the thing that for me, when I think about a Mediterranean garden, very much the style is about celebrating an outdoor lifestyle. It obviously comes from the Mediterranean, so France, Spain, Italy, Greece, alfresco dinings, gatherings with family, visions of sun-drenched landscapes, ancient olive trees, courtyards with flowering.
It's kind of very romantic, isn't it? It's kind of romantic in a non-fussy way.
Yeah, that's
right. And
I
think that's why it's so popular, not just because of our, the climate crisis and moving towards drought-hardy garden styles, but it's reminiscent of really happy holidays.
Yeah, and for me also
holidays.
This kind of casualness and a bit of a rustic, sense to your lifestyle as well. But I did actually, because I'm good on research, I did a bit of research about what a Mediterranean garden sort of is. And there is actually, as you know, but for our listeners who may not know, there is a Mediterranean Garden Society which is based in Greece, and there are Australian chapters. I don't know, there might be chapters elsewhere in the world as well, but we know the Australian chapter. They actually define what a Mediterranean garden style is in a very, I guess, more precise way. So as you said, it's designed to respond to the hot climate, cool winters with unpredictable rain, and they're very much integrated with the natural surroundings. So they are the 5 climate regions, so the Mediterranean basin, as we talked about, South Africa's Cape, central and southern California, central Chile, and also the south and southwestern parts of Australia. And the rainfall is obviously the critical bit, and it is characterised by 1,000 to 250 millimetres per year.
Yeah.
So that kind of is the formal.
Yeah.
Almost, this is where you have a Mediterranean garden.
Yeah, totally. And I think as we go through, we'll sort of unpack that a bit more to say, can you have a Mediterranean garden that is outside those climatic zones?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course you can, because it's a style.
It's a style, that's right. And so I think as we go through, we'll sort of really define that style and then say, how can we do this in other places that don't have that particular temperature range?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
So let's dive in.
Well, let me just say, you are listening to On Garden Design with Fleur and Sachi. We're longtime friends and also landscape designers. So hopefully you enjoyed lots in our series, and we've got another great couple of episodes coming up for you.
That is perfect, because I wouldn't have remembered to do that. So let's keep going on Mediterranean gardens. Where do you want to start?
Okay, well, let's have a look at – actually, you know what I want to do is I just want to put right up front, because it is about definition, is when I was having a look at this, it came to me that there's really 2 different types of Mediterranean gardens. There's the formal and then there's the informal. So looking at the formal, that's kind of got its origins in the Moorish influences. So that's come over from there's the Islamic and Persian style and a bit of Greek gardens. And that is, you see that very much in the bigger kind of structured Mediterranean gardens like Alhambra in Spain. And that includes significant water features, decorative parterre, clipped hedges. So it's really quite structured. But what we're probably talking about today is really the informal Mediterranean garden style, the kind of more naturalistic planting that sort of moved towards what we see more broadly represented in a more modern context. So who would this garden style suit?
Good question. They're low maintenance if you don't go for topiary.
Yeah.
So, and I think that is actually probably one of the key attractions of this garden style. And when you think about a Mediterranean garden, very much like we were talking about initially, if you're a garden entertainer, if you like to have people around, that sense of bringing people together outdoors in the alfresco setting, that's also something that might attract someone to the Mediterranean garden style. Anything to add to that?
I agree. I think it's there's a level of that informality that we talked about earlier, and I think that's the sort of those who are inclined towards a naturalistic style, low maintenance for sure, muted colours. And it's just quite an easy and forgiving style. I think there's not so many rules about this style as there is in some of the others.
I think that's right. It's a bit like when you think about the plants for this style, if you were being purist Mediterranean, you don't you'd only use Mediterranean plants, but actually a lot of Australian plants, for instance, lend themselves really nicely to incorporate into the Mediterranean style as well.
Yeah, right. So maybe we should go into the how then. Let's have a look at those sort of categories of how we build ourselves a Mediterranean garden.
Off you go.
Okay.
Where do you want to start?
Right. I think usually we start with layout.
Yes.
Because that's kind of a bigger picture kind of thing.
Yeah.
So when I think of the layout, this is where I see there's not as many rules around Mediterranean garden style, and often we see sort of really meandering series of gravel paths. There's kind of often there's slope involved with a bit of terracing. The gravel paths kind of just seamlessly form into gravel mulch, and you see sort of plants popping out kind of at random places, and then there's sort of spill out spaces wherever you can get some level or some shade, where there might be a bit of a structure, or the nice sort of overhanging tree where there's a nice bench on top and so in that area.
On top of the tree.
Top of the tree.
What do you know? That's a specialty.
Well, that's for good views of the ocean, you see.
That's right.
So that's kind of what I'm thinking for layout. Did you have a different idea about that?
No, not at all. But I guess there are some things that very much are part of the Mediterranean style that you would think about having in your layout. So like you said, a shady retreat somewhere, and that might be a pergola or a patio or a big tree that provides shade. Outdoor seating of some sort. Often there's some kind of water feature in these kind of styles as well. So you might have something like that in your layout too. And the gravel, I think, is sort of the foundational piece for the Mediterranean garden style as well. It is instead of lawn.
Yeah.
And it's that low water environment option.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think you mentioned a few things there that we can kind of jump into. Maybe we should unpack a bit more about materials.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So we've definitely got in our head limestone, gravel, limestone pebble, because that's kind of reminiscent of a lot of the Mediterranean geology. Also scree, I suppose.
Yeah. And I guess I'd almost broaden that category because this is such a not defined style. Warm toned, reflecting nature, stone, gravel, and all of that then becomes what your pavers and your hard materials are made out of.
Yeah, it's very warm, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But also quite muted. So you're not thinking about stark white limestone, for instance.
Yes.
Or really dark charcoal colours either. There's a lot of warmth in this one.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to when we were saying it really is a kind of a reminiscent of a holiday experience where you've had that feeling of that sun on you and everything just sort of feels kind of warm and very relaxed.
Yeah.
So that's what we want to bring into our gardens, wherever you are, even if you're in a cold place and you're doing a Mediterranean garden. You want to have that feeling that you're walking into somewhere that just sort of wraps you and is warm.
And I think the sort of the slightly warmer toned natural colours, the reason they work for the Mediterranean garden is because you're often dealing with harsh sunlight. And if you have something that's too dark or too white, it's too harsh in itself.
Yeah.
So you do have these muted, warmer colours that you'll use as part of your palette and your materials.
Yeah, look, that's so true. And I just think that is for those listeners from Australia and also like California, and we really know what harsh sunlight is. It's just so bright,
and it bakes everything, and everything feels crispified. And I think this is about making it not feel like that.
Yeah, for sure. So also other materials that I was thinking through is you mentioned before some sort of like an arbor or pergola that's a bit of a shade structure. It's definitely rustic in style, so usually a timber.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a bit weathered looking.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then, some rocks and boulders, that's all part of it. Maybe crazy pavers as the steppers because they're just not, there's no real neat, clean edges. It's all a bit rough and tumbled. But then you get these pops of colour, like these beautiful mosaic tiles or tiles on intricate tiling on a water feature or on a certain part of like a little patio area. So what are some of the things you think about with that?
Yeah, and I agree with you. It is, you typically use tiles which bring some of that colour pattern movement in, and, they might be used on your staircases or on your walls or, as you say, on your floors. And I think, they are the contrast with the muted sort of foundation layers of stone and wood and gravel that you have there. Absolutely.
And they're often quite bright.
They are.
So maybe bright blues, even reds and oranges.
Yeah.
And it's
So,
quite joyful.
And when you think about a Mediterranean garden, you often think of those sort of cobalt blues, terracotta, mustard yellow.
Yeah.
They are the kind of colours that often resonate with this style. Yeah.
It's kind of a lot of things can go well in this, isn't it?
They can. Because, you can have white and red in it as well, and I don't think there's a problem. But it's not somewhere you'd have pastel kind of colours other than, the muted colour, natural colours in your landscape that you will want to emulate with your gravel and stone and things. The other thing that comes to mind for me with Mediterranean gardens is the use of containers. So a lot of Mediterranean gardens will have terracotta clay as their sort of container, like pots.
Yeah, pots.
Yeah,
like those oversized oil urns. Yeah, the oil jars. Right. And they're really, really quite orange.
They are.
Terracotta.
Very
so, really
terracotta.
Deep. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And so that for me, they're often used as the real bold focal points in a Mediterranean garden style. And then you fill them with your bright coloured flowers, where the rest of the garden doesn't necessarily have a lot of that. Yeah. Because the Mediterranean garden, and we'll talk about the plants a bit later, but it is very much evergreen and often that sort of silvery, sort of grey, deep green foliage.
Yeah, and sagey green.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And your foliage is very much the thing that shines through in this garden, not the flowers. So your pots are where you put your bright flowers, your geraniums, your pelargoniums, that kind of thing. What else would you think about for materials in a terracotta garden, in a Mediterranean garden?
We can call it terracotta garden. A lot of it is. But I think when I was thinking of the mosaic kind of features or the use of intricate patterning, I think of very much the sort of the lovely little encaustic geometric tiles. So they that often get put onto water features or something that maybe the vertical side of it, vertical
exactly.
Sides of features, sort of wall, or maybe the side of a planter, something like that. So you got that side of it, but then also you see, particularly on the surfaces, of using like little pebbles set in. So you've got this kind of rough texture and pebbles, and they're arranged in little intricate patterns. So it's kind of like a ground mosaic that's done quite beautifully with different colours and usually rounded sort of pebbles. So I think that adds a really lovely texture.
And in fact, I actually think of Mediterranean gardens where they do want to have some texture or bring the eye into something. They'll often use different surfaces, even different pebbles in different arrangements can be a part of a Mediterranean garden where you have a pattern in addition to sort of the smaller, I guess, intricate detailing as well.
I think that we've really had got a good idea in our minds now about those muted background colours and then these little pops of colour that happen through some of the materials. But also in pops of colour, I think that's sometimes where we see the furniture in a Mediterranean garden is, the chairs or bench seats are often painted a bright red or that azure blue, or something like that brings in the colour, and that's quite a joyful part of these whole sort of gardens.
Yeah, that's right. That it adds to that background of the garden, which is muted colours, but then the evergreens without the pops of flower colour necessarily. So you're drawing that bright colour in from somewhere else, like the furniture or your tiles or your containers.
Yeah.
I guess the only other thing, they do tend to have often a fountain or a bird bath, or you might have a pool, because obviously in these climates you often want to go swimming. So they can also be part of the materials. But again, you want to be thinking about the materials are those muted colours, they're stone, they're something that reflects nature in some way. You're not looking at having a, bright, I guess, stark white pool in the environment here. You want something that's much more natural looking, subtle.
Yeah, I agree. But why don't we talk a bit about water, seeing you mentioned some pools and ponds. So I think traditionally water was very much a precious resource. So these gardens sort of traditionally really didn't have big pools or ponds of water, but more so small water bowls with some sort of effect of sound, and that cooling effect. And that's where you often see the rills, where that little water passes through a rill on the ground, and that creates the cooling. That's what that's all about, cooling. I love the look of them. I think it's lovely having water running through, your path, really.
Interesting to design into
Yes.
something. Like you
have to be very good at your levels.
Yeah, that's right.
It's quite tricky, and obviously an underground kind of reticulating pump system that kind of does it all for you. So probably not a cheap feature to add. And I also do wonder about the cleaning of them.
True, I hadn't even thought of that. I imagine, particularly if you've got things falling into it like leaves and whatever.
Yeah, and it would get probably a little sort of film of algae maybe. I think there would have to be a level of fairly high maintenance.
That's right.
With water.
I also struggle with sort of movement of water, particularly if it's not a large volume, although this is probably not very rational. But in quite a dry landscape, it just feels overwhelmingly luxurious somehow.
Yeah.
It doesn't sit right almost in this kind of an environment.
Yeah.
I feel like a container of water is almost better, but I know that obviously for Mediterranean gardens, and in fact the thing that we hadn't reflected on yet and that just came to me was they are quite sensory as well. So as you said, the sound of water running is not uncommon in a Mediterranean garden. Similarly, using plants that have very strong smells, this is where the oregano and the thyme and the rosemary and all those plants come in, jasmine even. So the water piece is also part of that sensory element to a Mediterranean garden too.
Yeah, and that's why I think generally the water features will be carefully selected, quite small, and very much about giving that feeling of coolness, but not very generous in their size because it's a precious resource.
Absolutely, and this garden is designed around it being a precious resource. Yeah. There's no watering this garden in summer.
Yeah,
that's the intent.
That's right.
Behind it all.
There's no underground irrigation systems.
No, this is what grows is what survives.
Yeah. It's a tough love garden.
It is absolutely, which is why it's a good low maintenance garden as well. Fantastic if you can't be bothered doing all the hard stuff.
And one thing, just a little sidebar is that Sachi and I are very excited because we are going on the Mediterranean Garden Society tour that's being hosted in Adelaide this year. So 2024 in October.
In Australia. That's
in
right.
Australia.
So Adelaide's in Australia. It's down the south.
And
Adelaide's environment for this.
Perfect. And Adelaide gets hot summers.
Hot, dry, really hot, dry summers, So it is going to be really exciting. And I'm sure that if we'd done this podcast after that visit, we would have been waxing lyrical beyond what we're doing now.
Oh, we'll be so much more clever then.
We will. That's right. But hopefully that will come through in our businesses where we will be able to incorporate much more of what actually works in practice. Because I don't have a Mediterranean garden. So I imagine this garden is very much a trial and error garden for particular environments, working out what does work and what doesn't.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Maybe that's a good segue into actually talking about the plants that go into one of these.
Let's do it. Let's talk about plants.
So where would you start for this?
Well, immediately that vision comes to me as sort of shrubby Mediterranean vegetation and includes, your olive trees, there's citrus, vines. You mentioned some of the beautiful sensory ones before, lavender, rosemary, thyme, oregano. So I also really do think about succulents. Because they're just they're fabulous, agaves as well and sedums, those kind of things, as well as grasses, ornamental grasses. True. These are such tough and forgiving plants and such a range, so you could really do something quite beautiful with that combination.
Absolutely. And in fact, if we're just reflecting on that sort of sensory element, the grasses bring movement. Into landscapes as well. So, and grass is definitely part of this for me. So particularly the blue fescues, carex, which often you get with that sort of creamy stripe, and pennisetums, which are just beautiful if you're in the environment and you don't have frost like we do.
Yeah. But some of the Australian ones for us would be pretty tough, like the poa.
The poas,
and the Ozstipa.
Yes.
Yeah. So they would, you just look at what would work in your own climate and say, well, I just adjust that slightly. But the intent there of the breezy grasses and the really tough that just don't require any extra care is ideal.
And they give you a lot of structure and movement for a lot of the year too.
Yeah.
So if I go back to what we were talking about before, back to the colours and sort of the plant palette generally for a Mediterranean design garden, because these plants are the hardy, drought-tolerant ones, you've often got I guess I wanted to say they're designed for, harsh environments, but they are. They've evolved to them. So they've often got those light reflecting silvery leaves, or they're very furry, velvety.
Or very fine.
Or very fine,
sort of
needle-like.
needle-like.
Yeah, that's right. So those are all of the plants that often you'll find in a Mediterranean garden. So you get a lot of foliage variety and texture. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for. And they're often, as I said before, evergreen. They provide a lot of structure. You're not looking for flowers here.
Yeah.
Although you can get flowers, like bougainvilleas often feature in the right climates.
And geraniums.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. But they're not a feature necessarily of, the whole garden. They are put in places as focal points or for key elements.
It's really about foliage. That's what I'm hearing from you. It's all about foliage. And with that, we've talked in other episodes about how to sort of celebrate foliage contrast. So you've got your sort of your grasses, you've got your tall spikies, you've got your bigger leafed sort of ones, or different shapes really.
And as soon as you said the succulents, I was thinking, and they're perfect because they're either sort of the structural succulents like the agaves, the big things and the yuccas, and then you might have the ground covers, which are, you might have your sedums and your echeveras that are the ground cover.
And then the lovely big, like cotyledon.
Yes.
The big kind of fleshy, pig's ears.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Particularly the silvery one for me.
Yes, I love that cotyledon orbiculata.
That's it,
It is?
orbiculata.
Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. I love that one.
They are fabulous. But the other plants, so stachys is another one that comes to my mind as well, lambshead, so the very woolly kind of plants. And then I guess, olives, as you said before, they are so much part of this kind of environment, as are the Italian cypress.
Yeah.
Very much a classic, I guess. A pomegranate is the other one.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so, and that's a bit of an unusual one because they're not evergreen.
You know what's interesting when you're saying a lot of this is a lot of these plants are inherently edible.
That is true, except for the cypress. I think I've eaten one of them before.
I don't know if I'd want to try a cypress, but when you look at most of the plants we're talking about, they probably have really morphed into this design kind of planting palette because they are useful as well. That's
right. Because the other climate that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about a Mediterranean garden is often a grape. And it will be, and they often do feature climbers over, if they've got a structure like your shade structure, because it's a feature of these gardens, you might have some kind of an ornamental grape or a real grape, a jasmine or a bougainvillea, as we spoke about before as well.
Yeah, and they're pretty tough.
They are.
I wonder with things like citrus, because I always thought citrus took quite a bit of water.
They do.
So how does that get managed?
Yeah, and I actually, because I had a bit of a read about citrus as well, because I had it, they kind of stick out from this, range of plants that we're talking about. In a lot of places where there is quite cold winters, they tend to be containerised. And so maybe that's how they get managed, in that, they are sort of more nurtured because they are there to be productive as well as attractive.
Whereas your olive trees, they're just out on the gnarly, windswept kind of gravel hillside.
And they'll do brilliantly.
Yeah, and they'll just be thriving.
Yeah, that's right.
That's something you see with talking about the trees, things like oleander as well. It's beautiful.
Yes.
The trees, they tend to be in groves, or occasionally brought out as one featured tree somewhere. But then you often get these sort of groves of trees, which I think is quite beautiful, because walking into in a hot hillside and you go into a grove of trees, it's got that really beautiful effect of cooling.
Grove, that's right. And I also think of hillsides, and sort of you get a grove which is almost on a terrace somewhere on the steepness of that slope. That, very evocative for me for these gardens too.
Certainly.
The other thing that I thought was worth mentioning is ground covers are, along with gravel, used as a lawn substitute, and often they're also used to sort of soften the edges of the garden bed with a gravel transition, for instance, so that there is that natural sense of it's not, a hard and rigid kind of very
no neat
clipped,
edges
environment. You have much more of everything blends into the natural surroundings feeling.
Yeah, there's no landscape edging along your paths in this case. It's all just sort of
that's right.
And, the odd plant that just sort of grows up in the middle of the path, that's really quite welcomed in the Mediterranean garden
and in fact,
style.
I think they tend to do a fair bit of, allowing self-seeding to go along with the annuals.
Yeah.
also is something, yes.
Definitely.
Very
But one thing
significant.
to just, really emphasise when you're talking about the ground covers, there really is no room for lawn in this style at all.
No.
So it's all, like those little creeping, tough, hardy ground covers that just survive on a little bit of dew.
That's right. And the smell of an oily rag. That is so true.
For sure.
So let's just have a bit of a chat, because the clipped sort of hedging and topiary can also feature in this as well.
Well, tell me about what you're thinking there. I think of the tall cypress pines lining a bit of an avenue, or punctuating the landscape. I sort of see that. But in terms of topiary, what kind of clipping are you talking?
Well, I'm thinking about just pretty much the rounded balls. So, they will do things like a boxwood and I'm going to get this wrong because I always get it wrong, Eleagnus.
Oh, Eleagnus.
Eleagnus.
It's the non-gelatinous version of Eleagnus.
That's right. Not gelatinous, it's Eleagnus. Teucrium as well.
Yeah.
They're kind of clipped to form a shape. And in fact, the Australian designer Fiona Brockhoff, I get a Mediterranean feel from a lot of her designs.
Yes.
And she uses closer to the, whatever structure you've got, building, pool, whatever, she will clip things to make it look much more deliberate, and then sort of let it blend into the environment as it goes, back into the natural landscape, which is not then clipped.
Yeah, that's very true, and I could clear visions of what you're talking about when you look at her work. But when you look at these sort of plants, we often see that a lot of them are naturally mounded anyway. So the way a lavender grows, the way a Santolina grows, a lot of that sort of, if it's left unclipped, it does have that sense of mounding in the landscape.
That is true, and you are so right. So much of that is a natural growth form. So I think it's just reflecting that in a lot of the plantings that you might put in.
Good discussion about what plants that we think are typical of Mediterranean garden style. I've got a question for you, and that is, can you create a Mediterranean garden using Australian natives?
Oh, that is a good question. I think you can, and I think probably the best result is, like we do with all of our gardens, mixing local species with exotics that do well as well. And I'm saying that because if you want a Mediterranean garden, an olive tree is a great opportunity, or a pomegranate is a great opportunity. Yeah. And I'm thinking about our climate now in Canberra in Australia, because they grow really well, but you might want to supplement that with some natives that actually also grow well and have those Mediterranean characteristics we were talking about before. They might have the fluffy, velvety leaves, or they might be silver. And some of the ones that I'm thinking about are Westringia, some of the Correas as well.
So it's really what you're saying to me is it's about choosing plants that are right for your climate, but also have the look of the Mediterranean.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
So the foliage form really dominates here. It doesn't necessarily matter what the species is, as long as it has that kind of silvery grey look, or the sort of
or the very
rounded
evergreen kind of small leaf look, or the sagey colour as well. I mean, for instance, I'm also thinking about, if you didn't want to use olive trees, for instance, and I should also mention that there are olive trees in a particular species in Australia that is very weedy, so you don't want to go there either. But melaleucas, they would be a good alternative as an Australian native for an olive if you're in the right environment for particular melaleucas. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
So there you go.
Yeah, in fact, actually, I just wanted to mention one book that I really, really got a lot out of, just reading it and getting an understanding, but it also makes me think about, we'll have a conversation on soils.
Yes.
Yeah. But I want to refer to a book by Olivier Philippi.
Who's very well known in this space.
Yeah, and the Dry Gardening Handbook. I mean, I bought a copy of that about 6 months ago. I love it. But one of the things I wanted to really talk about there is he is this big advocate for, if you're going to plant into this style where you're having really harsh summers, about this basin planting technique. So he talks about
basin planting technique.
Yeah, basically, sort of think a whole lot of little craters in your landscape. So he digs a hole, a minimum 600 mil wide diameter, that is, and about 200 mil depth, and the plant goes in that. And so the idea is that when it does get
catchment,
a little catchment,
yeah.
And he says it's about deep penetration to the root zone, and then the deeper that penetration is, the longer that plant can survive in really harsh situations, like all through summer. It doesn't need watering. And so that's a really, that's a technique that we have to really think about, because it just avoids all that surface runoff where you're wasting the water.
Yeah.
So it's about really water-wise system in a climate that's just so harsh.
And I think the gravel lends itself very well there again as well, in terms of being a surface that actually allows the water to infiltrate and get captured and doesn't just run off like it might on paving or other hard surfaces.
So true. And he actually says that, this is his quote, automatic watering systems are the worst invention for modern Mediterranean gardeners.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, so this really is, like we said right up front, this is a garden type that requires no irrigation, and actually if you irrigate your plants, you probably kill them.
And in fact, if you're irrigating your plants in a Mediterranean garden, it's not a Mediterranean garden. That's what I'm hearing.
That's it. It doesn't make it Mediterranean at all.
That's right. So let's have a quick conversation about soils. And then we probably need to wrap up.
Yeah. I think the key one there is, because you know how we've talked about, using different plants according to your climate zones. When you have, like we have in Canberra, really clay soils, so how does that go? Because Mediterranean is not clay soil. It's just shaly, rocky, high drainage soils.
Yeah, high drainage is a real characteristic of the Mediterranean soils. So what would you do to correct your soils?
Yeah, well, I was really emboldened thinking I could create this Beth Chatto style gravel garden. But then I looked at it and I was like, actually, she builds on 2 metres of gravel. It's like shale. And I thought, oh God, I don't have that. I've just got
thick dense clay.
I've got about 3 centimetres of nice soil and then the rest of it's clay. So I think you have to actually build up. Got to create the drainage. You've got to go up, put a lot of sand and gypsum in. And
although I think for me that kind of defeats the purpose of being more environmental and sustainable. For me, it's actually then you look at your plant choices, and because we also have harsh, dry climate and summers, we can have a Mediterranean garden, but you're building it on a clay base. So you're looking for plants that can cope with a bit of waterlogging. If, the drainage, because the drainage isn't great, if you have a big rain event, and particularly in winter when you might have more rain.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for us, probably the more, sustainable way to go.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. That's it. It's about picking the right plants for your climate and thinking through the soil issue as well.
I think it goes back to this, you work with what you've got rather than trying to change what you've got to do something that isn't really right for that environment.
Because then you're right, it's sustainable. It's about long term. Awesome. Okay, I've got a few more questions for you.
Oh, here we go.
Just a quick one. We've talked about this style being a bit kind of random and, plants kind of popping up where they want to.
Now I'm worried about the question.
This is really tough.
Yeah.
So, we've done a podcast on cottage gardens in the past. What do you think is the key difference between a cottage garden style and a Mediterranean garden style?
Look, for me, this is much more about a Mediterranean garden style. It's probably about the plants, because the plants are more evergreen. There's more sort of long-lived structure in the garden, and it's not about the flowers and the colour like it is in a cottage garden. I do think that there's probably a bit more placement than you would in a cottage garden, which you really do. You think about your colour palette and you think about, the mix of plants you have in a cottage garden, and you just chuck them sort of all in together. Whereas I think in the Mediterranean garden, the placement's more deliberate. Yeah. And then the plants are evergreens. It's not about the flowers. It's not about the colour. The annuals don't feature in the foundation garden in the Mediterranean garden.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I think that's just spot on. I didn't really have an answer.
No.
But I think you're right. It really is.
I feel like I've been tested.
Well, no, because I actually really wanted to know. And I think what really the sort of the nugget of all that is that it's about the plants.
Yes.
And Mediterranean garden is about that foliage choice and that planting presence and the form. So
and that is there year through.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, then one last question for you.
Oh. my heart
This is
rate's
tough,
going
isn't
up.
it?
Exactly.
And you haven't even gone on the tour yet.
That's right.
You might have different answers after the tour.
I may.
My last question for you is, what can go wrong when implementing this style? We've made it sound easy.
We have.
Where do you really stuff it up?
Oh, gee. I'm going to throw that one back at you while I think.
Well,
what do you think?
I think maybe trying to be too neat.
Yes. Yeah, possibly.
And trying to do clean, neat edges. I think that's where you go wrong. And probably a big one is you just can't do lawn.
Yes.
In this style.
If you have lawn in this, it's not a Mediterranean
throws it
garden.
out, yeah.
That's right. And or irrigation.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And probably the other one that comes to me, which we have talked about, is if you try and do cool colours, like a lot of gardens are doing grey tiles or kind of white, I think you get it wrong. It has to be warm.
Yeah, I agree with that as well, absolutely. And then I think this one is very much about the plant choices, and thinking about, again, the same thing, the structure and the, evergreenness of things, and that you are choosing the plants that will survive in your environment as opposed to the ones that might actually survive in Greece.
Yeah.
Because obviously, like we were just talking about, your soil may be quite different.
Yeah.
They're probably the thing. Yeah, I think what you said, though, that there are some elements here that are really very specific to a Mediterranean garden in terms of colours, layout. This isn't about crisp edges.
I reckon that's probably almost our summary.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think
We've done a great job.
Oh, without even knowing.
You passed. I think you got 3 out of 3.
Oh,
well
thank
done.
God.
A bit of food for
I'm going
thought.
to have to think of really hard questions to ask you next time.
I know. Well, bring it on. So, you've been listening to On Garden Design with Fleur and Sachi. If you've liked this episode, please like us on all our socials.
And you can find us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a follow.
Yeah, and if you've really enjoyed it, if you like what we do, buy us a coffee on Ko-fi. And we always get a comment from you too, which we absolutely love. So thank you.
We do indeed. It's been great talking with you, and we'll talk to you again in another fortnight.
Bye.
See you later.